Good evening, everybody. This is the Planning and Development Committee, and we have a lot of people signed up here to speak. And first item on our agenda is approval of our regular minutes of May 22nd. May I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
Okay. Items for consideration. First one is Ordinance 7017, amending the portions of the City of Evanston zoning code regulating generators. Could I have a motion? Could people speak into their microphones, please?
Move approval.
Okay.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? Everybody's okay with that?
Well, we'll talk about it later.
But this is really a good place to talk about it, seeing it's for introduction, and this is the committee that deals with these things. So
All right, let me get to...
Alderman Ravel would like to talk about it.
I do.
Go
I
ahead.
just have a question.
Okay.
So I'm assuming that this incorporating generators in our ordinance would then, we would also apply our mechanical equipment noise level limits that we recently approved, they would apply there as well.
Director Neiden.
Good evening, Johanna Leonard, Community Development Director. Yes, it would.
Thanks.
It's really being
So-
treated like the other mechanical equipment that is
Correct.
covered in the zoning ordinance. Alderman Wilson.
Well, I hesitate on the permanently installed generators because we've got, things like hospitals, schools, things of that nature. So to me, rather than the setback requirements, it seems to be more appropriate to use a standard that would be noise generated based as opposed to distance. And there are things that could be done to screen the sound, whatever you might have. But as far as the locations, large institutional structures might not really be realistically able to make the modifications to have the setbacks. So I guess if we're looking at this, I would want to limit it to the portable generators because that's kind of what it seems to be addressing. If we're going to include all generators, I think we should rewrite it such that it's more sound level based as opposed to setback based.
As opposed to being in
Distance.
certain residential districts or zones, et cetera? I mean,
That's my 2 cents.
so you think it needs work? That's what you're really saying?
Yeah, I think it needs work.
Alderman Simmons.
I will echo Alderman Wilson. It's unclear on how we would protect institutions, schools, and hospitals with this ordinance. And also, is this inspired by environmental matters or noise alone?
My understanding is that this was part of a piece of the code not speaking to generators, period.
Okay, thank you.
Alderman Nguyen.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I think that we should clarify that this is likely for residential. I read this as if it was applying to residential districts because there are many people who have health reasons for having a permanently installed generator in their home so that they don't have any failure of power. So someone might be needing medical care that requires them to always have power in the house. So in my mind, this would likely be like an air conditioner unit that many people have. And so that you would be able to put it in some area like we permit air conditioners. And in addition, it's unlikely that a generator would be operated, especially in a residential area, unless there was a power failure. So it would be a relatively short amount of time that it would occur. So I'd like some clarity on this too.
Okay. All right. Alderman Fisk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, we've had a problem with the generator at a facility in my ward, and part of the problem has come with the regular testing of the generators, which seem to run for at least a half an hour once or twice a week, and creating a lot of noise. So I think there are different situations, and I support getting some clarification on this.
Okay, so we have a couple of choices. We can move this to the council with those directions to staff, or we can, since this is not an urgent matter, we could hold it here and reconsider it or consider it at our next meeting.
I'd like to move to hold it in committee.
I would agree. Okay? Then second, Alderman Simmons, did you want to speak to it? Okay. All right, all those in favor of holding it in committee, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, that's good. Moving right along. Next item is the matter of 1726 Hinman Avenue, granting landmark status. I understand, first of all, that there are, yes, we see your signs. I could just tell by looking at Mary why you were here. So we have lots of people signed up to speak, and also I understand that the owner of the property would like to make a presentation, and that the applicant would like to make a presentation. Who would like to make a presentation first? Okay, the
Alderman Rainey-
applicant. Yes.
Alderman Rainey, may I
Wait,
just?
Wait.
I'm sorry.
Just wait. You would like to make a presentation, right? Okay. Does the owner of the property want to make, I just want to get everybody sorted out. You would like to make a presentation too? Okay. All right. I think we're going to let the owner of the property go first and then the applicant, okay? So we'll hear-
I'm sorry,
Yes,
Alderman Rainey,
sure.
if I can just interrupt for a moment. I believe that there's interest on the part of the owner of the property to hold this.
I'm going to ask him.
I'm just,
Right, well, the owner of the property said he would like to speak.
okay, I'll let them decide what they want to do.
Well, I'm going to let him decide because I'm sort of like chairing this. Okay.
I'm-
Just relax. Okay. Yes, what's going on here?
There's nothing going on. We just for the sake of.
It's already been held.
Okay, so,
Okay, so talk to us. Tell us what you want.
well, we're prepared to make a case, and just want to know, I mean, we were hoping for an extension, but if the chair so decides that we need to proceed today, so be it. We're ready to present.
What is the reason you want to extend to?
We are evaluating all of our property options, and we want to make sure that we reach the right decision. This is a very complicated matter, Alderwoman, because as you know, we're looking at renovation costs of more than several $1 million. There were already plans in place for an expansion of the property. And frankly, when this matter came before us, it frankly took the property owners by surprise. And we were caught off, last minute after we had already began a process, a very lengthy process, as required by the city. And so I would submit to you that this is a very complex issue, and we're requesting for the opportunity to thoroughly vet all of our options.
Okay, I'm going to ask the committee to get involved in this, but a few weeks ago, we were ready to proceed, and you asked for an extension then, to hold it then, and I said, because you were the property owners, that would be the only courteous thing to do, and so we did that. And, people said, well, you always ask for delays. And you were ready to proceed then if we had to proceed, and now there's another delay. I mean, is this going to turn out positively, or is there going to be ongoing delays? I'm not sure. Is this for good reason or just to drag this out? That's what I'm looking at.
There is good reason.
Okay.
I just want to make clear that Sigma Chi has always been a very good neighbor
I know,
and member of
I
the
know,
community.
I know, and you
so
own the property, you have all sorts of rights. I understand that. I'm very sensitive to that. Let me just talk to the committee. Now, Judy, I know that you're very involved in this. How do you all feel? I mean,
I'm putting my light on. And
Attorney Mason Cup, what? We've held this,
Right. You've already held this once. Council Rule
we'd
8.
have to table this.
Good evening. I have no idea where my mic is, so I'll just stand right now. Michelle Mason Cup, Deputy City Attorney. So City Council Rule 18.12 indicates that you cannot hold it over for a second occasion. You already held it once. So if you're following the letter of your rules, you can't continue it for a second meeting. Thank you.
I just wanted.
We could table it to a date.
no, it is for introduction only, though.
Yes, it is for introduction.
Okay.
So I'm going to suggest that we move it for introduction, and then we have a little discussion about, what we're going to do. I think we ought to let the applicant make his presentation.
Okay.
If the committee agrees, and we can hear the public. And I think it couldn't hurt for the owner of the property to hear this information also.
We should make it clear, we're prepared to go forward as the owner of the property this evening, but because, as Mr. Flores suggested, these other concerns we need to look at in terms of the property and other uses, that's what Alderman Fisk's comment really goes to, is to allow those to be fully vetted. But to go forward this evening, we're fully prepared to go forward.
I'm not sure
make
what
one
went on
comment?
behind the scenes, so that I wasn't privy to that. But when we say we could go forward tonight, we are not going to make a decision
I understand.
tonight, okay? So that wouldn't be for 2 weeks anyway, so why don't we hear, you don't have to make a presentation
can.
tonight. But I'm just saying, you don't have to. I would let you do that at the next meeting, if you so chose to do so. Okay? Is that okay with the committee? We'll just hear.
Yes. Lights in.
Okay, all right. Alderman Fisk.
Yes, Alderman Rainey, that's fine if we introduce it. It will come back to council at the next council meeting, which I believe is on
The 26th.
the 26th.
It could also be moved to the council and referred back to committee if we wanted to hear the owners in committee. We could do that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So would you like to go second, or would you like to speak to us now?
We can speak to you now, as you
Okay.
suggested.
I'm sorry, I didn't know. If anybody had given me a heads up, I
No.
would have handled this differently.
No, that's fine. Let me first introduce myself. I'm Hal Morris.
Hi,
I'm
Hal.
an attorney representing the Sigma Chi Foundation, which is the owner of the property. I have with me this evening my partner, Manny Flores, who spoke a few moments ago, as well as the representative of the owner, Noah Phelps, and the expert that we had that testified before the Historic Preservation Commission, Scott Hesner. Okay, we certainly appreciate the time that the city council, the city staff, and everyone involved with this in Evanston has put into this nomination. But I think we need to start with some very, if you will, fundamental issues. The first fundamental issue is this case comes before you and comes before the city in a very unusual manner. It is not a request by the city. It is not a request by city staff. Instead, it is a request by a citizen to ask another owner, another taxpayer in the city of Evanston to have their property landmarked and their property rights then changed. That is, I would submit to you, is very unusual. And as we indicate under the various provisions of your city ordinance, the very high burden to, if you will, put constraints or limitations on an owner in terms of their property are not met in this case. There was a split vote before the commission, 5-3, to recommend landmarking in this case. It was recommended under 3 provisions of your code. It was recommended first under A3 that it exemplifies an architectural type or style, under A4 that it identifies with an important individual or historical event, and lastly, it has integrity. As you'll hear from, we'll have Mr. Hesner speak, it really doesn't meet any of those criteria. And why doesn't it? This property has not been hidden from the city of Evanston. It has been on the city's radar for upwards of 40 years. It has never been, despite the preservation ordinance's statement and mandate that The Preservation Commission and the city staff conduct an ongoing survey to identify historically, culturally, and architecturally significant properties and to nominate and designate. It has never previously been identified by the city staff, by the Preservation Commission. In fact, it was left off when the Lakeshore Historic District was established. It was left off again when the Lakeshore Historic District was re-reviewed. And the city staff in the fourth quarter of 2016 granted permits to suspend the utilities of the property. So it wasn't once, it wasn't twice, it was 3 times it was known to the city. The property has never been nominated by the commission or the city staff for inclusion as on the historic register, and the property has never previously been listed as eligible for any sort of historic designation. Architecturally, as Mr. Hesner will testify, it is not a representative of a style or a derivation of a style, and it isn't style setting. Historically, you will also hear the property is not historically significant. John Neiden is a name you will hear substantially, but what we need to remember is John Neiden is not an architect of the same prominence that we typically look at architects. He is prolific, yes. He was accomplished, yes, but he is not an architect, as you will hear, that is recognized by the Association of Architects or any other architectural, if you will, body as being historically important. The property, you will also hear, lacks substantial integrity. Fundamentally, it lacks integrity that it doesn't match the style. But it also lacks integrity because, as you'll hear, the immense costs to put this property online are, before you open the property up, in excess of $3 million. Those are costs that, of course, the City of Evanston is well aware of when it deals with its own historic property, the Clark Mansion along the lakefront. That is a recognized historic property, one that has found its way into the fabric of Evanston, and the costs there are staggering. Here, for an individual, not-for-profit, charitable owner, the costs here are not only staggering, they're impossible. In addition, that would affect the mission of the Sigma Chi Foundation. That mission is to be a charity, to give money to students in undergraduate and graduate education for their education, for housing, for suicide prevention, for drug awareness prevention, and for other events such as that. And that would be substantially curtailed if this was landmarked. There would also be a substantial negative precedent we'd submit to the city. Here we have a situation not where the landowner has come to you, not where the city staff has identified the property, but where a third party says, I like that building, you should then landmark it. Without reaching the very high standard to abridge a property owner's property rights, without meeting the very exacting standards of your own ordinance, what we would simply do is we would have immense administrative costs and possible costs regarding litigation. There is talk about a prior covenant on the property. That prior covenant never spoke to the situation we're faced to now. That prior covenant in the 1970s was really focused on 2 things. 1, we don't want a rooming house or transient housing. And 2, if there's a building there, we want to make sure it's residential in character. There's no suggestion that there will be a rooming house should this not be landmarked, and there's no suggestion that whatever alternate building is put there would not similarly be residential in character. The Sigma Chi Foundation is willing to continue to work with the city to have whatever goes on that lot at 1726 to fit with the neighborhood and fit with the vision for Evanston. If for whatever reason the city deems that it is so historically significant, although we would submit that it is not architecturally historically significant, the Sigma Chi Foundation is willing to sell that building for $1 to the city or anyone else and share in the costs of relocating it if someone feels that it is that important. We do not feel it is, and as Mr. Hesner will testify, the architect, he can give you a better, if you will, flavor and context for the building we're actually dealing with.
Thank you, Hal. Good evening to all. I am Scott Hesner, and I'm an architect with the firm, the Hesner Corporation. We're located in Libertyville. Just a little context here. My grandfather started our firm in 1932. So this is a long-standing firm, never large, always productive, I'd like to say. And it follows 3 generations in our family. My brother is an architect, and I hold licenses in Illinois, in Iowa, and Florida. I'm also a licensed interior designer. We have a second company called Hescorp Construction, and Hescorp Construction builds probably 50 to 60% of the projects the Hesner Corporation designs. We're a general contractor. We're also a construction management organization. So I'm looking at this this structure from a wide variety of experience. And I can't help but dissect things as I look at them. So my goal tonight is to distill my thoughts so that we can all leave here on an early time frame. So Colonial Revival, let's start there. Colonial Revival it has some very basic standards. The standards of Colonial Revival are facade symmetry. It's critical. The facades have to have symmetrical architectural elements. And this is not just on the front or the back, but on the sides. Rectilinear plan. The footprint of the building has to have a rectilinear plan. The elevations typically on the sides are mirrored. They reflect each other. They're the same. Entrances are centered. And when I say centered, they're centered on a symmetrical facade. The buildings are composed of brick or clapboard siding. And the roofs have either slate tile or asphalt shingle. This project that was designed by John Neiden, it differs from the standard of colonial revival architecture. None of the building facades are symmetrical. None of them are balanced. The front porch is not centered on the entrance to the facility, the entrance to the house. Now, there can be front porches. There can be enclosed receiving rooms, but they must be symmetrical. They must be symmetrical on the entrance to the building. There are derivations in application of architectural elements on each facade of this building. Yes, bay windows are components of Colonial Revival, but not as they're used on the north elevation of this building. The house footprint is a square, and the footprint to a degree comes from what the previous house was. This house borrowed part of a foundation of a Queen Anne house. This architect used components that he liked. Architects do that. They feel that they can compose and organize architectural elements the way they choose. But this architect did not organize these architectural elements in a way that resembles or matches Colonial Revival architecture. Without the basic symmetrical organization of a facade, just that one element, this house should not be landmarked because it's not a Colonial Revival piece of architecture. John Neiden, he was a productive architect, and I value that. He made lots of contributions to the built environment. He worked on many projects. I don't know if I could call him prolific, but he did work on many projects, and I have to give him that. But as someone who is considered noteworthy and great, which is where landmark architecture comes from, John Neiden doesn't appear in any of the books that I've seen. Now, these are composed of people with names like Mies, Walter Netsch, Frank Lloyd Wright, Dankmar Adler, Louis Sullivan. These are all architects with Chicago connections. But John Neiden doesn't appear in any of that. He doesn't appear in this particular book, which I value. It's the AIA Guide to Chicago Architecture. Now, this book has everybody and people I have never even heard of who have worked on noteworthy buildings, buildings that have landmark status, they're on national registers, they're important to people. This has everybody in it. This is produced by the American Institute of Architects in Chicago. There's no John Neiden in here. And that was one of the first things that I went and researched. Where's this guy, have his work? Where are his drawings? Where are his archives? Where can I go see this stuff? And there's no place to go see it. I know that there's a book at the Evanston Public Library here about John Neiden, but I think that's the only book, or it's the only place for that book, because I haven't found any others.
Could I remind you that we have an entire city council meeting to do? And
Yes.
So if you
Very
could
good.
just sort of
I will distill. I will distill. Okay, let's move on to costs. Okay, something we can all relate to. We've established a figure. Our general construction company established a figure, $3.2 million to restore the structure in a useful condition that meets the exterior requirements for a landmark structure, and that addresses basic improvements for an interior. $3.2 million. You can spend that in the blink of an eye. This does not include costs involving accessibility. It doesn't include costs involving structural issues that will be encountered once the building gets opened up. There's a myriad of issues. This building is no longer what it once was. And these structures, landmark structures, something you're going to get involved with involving history, they're always costly endeavors. They are. The money is, you've heard the sayings, it's money pit. It's a domino effect. One thing leads to another, and this would be the same. So what I'm going to say here is that the building doesn't meet the basic standard for colonial revival architecture. This architect, although a hardworking, good architect who produced many structures, doesn't meet the standard that many architects with landmark buildings have. And the cost that would be imposed upon the Sigma Chi Foundation would be immense. And it doesn't relate well to what it deserves. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me just sum up. This comes before this committee of the City Council based on 3 recommendations. One, the recommendation found in 2-8-4A3 that says that the property is an exemplification of an architectural type, style, or design distinguished by innovation, rarity, uniqueness, or overall quality of design, detail, materials, and craftsmanship. Is it a nice building? To some, it obviously is. But is it an exemplification of a style? No. Is it an exemplification of something that set a new style? No. Is it unique? Even if we assume it's colonial revival? No. There are other colonial revival structures that have already been landmarked and preserved in Evanston. This is not another one of those. There's nothing special about the architecture. It was John Neiden, designed for John Neiden, but not in a style. It is quite candidly an amalgam of things he wanted in a building, but it's not something that was followed by anyone else. Now, I know that you have heard, and you will obviously hear, that people find it to be an attractive and a building that should be kept. But I would remind you, the only experts that have testified before either the commission or this committee of the City Council is Mr. Hesner. Everyone else is giving a personal opinion, which we respect because we all can have our own opinions, but objectively, on a professional level, it does not exemplify a style, so it does not meet A3. The Preservation Commission also said it met under A4. A4 is the building is an identification as a work of an architect, designer, engineer, or builder whose individual work is significant in the history or development of the city, the state, the Midwest region, or the United States. Was Mr. Neiden an architect that designed many structures? Yes. But is that a reason to take an otherwise non-noteworthy older home from the 1920s requiring significant costs and say, we're landmarking it because there's other structures that have been landmarked that are his? I'd submit to you, no. It is something that is not significant in that regard. It is, if we close our eyes and we say, who are the major architects that we know? I would submit that this name just doesn't come to us. Now, people will say, yes, he's important in the Swedish community, and that may be very well true. But what is not true is that he is noteworthy as an architect of great renown. Was he, use the word prolific, was he active? Yes, of course. But this building, once again, this is not where George Washington slept. It's an older building where he slept, Mr. Neiden, but it's not George Washington's home. Lastly, the commission voted that it had the integrity of landmarks, that an area, property, structure, or site that meets any one or more of the criteria we just discussed shall also have sufficient integrity of location, design, materials, and workmanship to make it worthy of preservation or restoration. Here I think we need to pause and think again, how did this come before the city? It did not come from city staff. It did not come from the Preservation Commission. It did not come from the owner. It came from a third party who says, I like the building, it should be kept. That is something that is very rare, and I'd submit probably has not really occurred in this community. As such, there is a high standard to take away property rights, and they simply haven't been met here. An interesting sidelight is when the Sigma Chi Foundation purchased this property in the 1970s, it purchased it from John Neiden's then surviving daughter. Did the surviving daughter in 1970 come to the city and say, this should be landmarked as my father's building is such an exemplification of a style? No. Did she come to the city and say, this should be landmarked as my father was so important in the community? No. What happened instead? This city established the Lakeshore Historic District across the street from this property and left it out. Now, we heard in front of the commission that was just a mistake. Okay, perhaps it was. The Lakeshore Historic District and all the historic districts were then re-reviewed. It wasn't included again. Even if there wasn't a specific attempt to include things, the city staff didn't say, we made a mistake, we should put it in. No. What happened next? When the Sigma Chi Foundation, with its plans, came to the city building department issued permits to cease the use of utilities. Did anyone in the city say, oh wait, this is an important structure? No. And I'm not here, and I will not say that your city staff simply dropped the ball and didn't know what it was doing. Your city staff does know what it is doing. As a consequence, we would suggest to you that under the circumstances here, this is simply not appropriate for landmarking. Now, as I said, and in closing, this city is, I can say probably unfortunately, very aware of the substantial burden and the substantial cost associated with bringing a historic structure back online. That's the Hadley Clark Mansion. That is a recognized landmark, part of the fabric of the community, used as a public facility, and the costs there are staggering to a city. Consider those costs with a property such as this that the owner didn't ask, the city staff didn't ask, the commission didn't ask, and imposing those costs on a charitable foundation. That simply, I would submit to you, can't really be appropriate unless we can find that there is such an overwhelming conclusion that this exemplifies colonial revival, an overwhelming conclusion that this particular man was of such prominence, such as George Washington, we need to keep his home, and an overwhelming conclusion that there's enough integrity in that structure. What we presented to the commission, which is the rest of the slide presentation to my left, shows that when you step off the curb and walk up to this house, there are substantial problems. There are walls that are falling, there is tuck pointing, there's rotted eaves, there's a whole list of problems that Mr. Hesner has gone through, and that's before you look behind, if you will, the curtain, the walls and the ceilings, where almost certainly those costs will even increase more. So landmarking will create for this community, if it would occur, effectively a white elephant. It would create something that simply couldn't economically or feasibly be done. It has no integrity. It does not meet colonial revival, which is what the commission said it meant, and it is not of someone of great enough prominence. As a consequence, we appreciate your attention, and we ask that this committee not accept the recommendation of the Historic Preservation Commission. And to the extent that you'd like us to answer any questions, we're prepared to do, and I will reiterate that if someone does find this to be of such prominence to themselves personally, or of course to the city itself, the Sigma Chi Foundation would be willing to simply for $1 sell it to you and help you through whatever cost it was going to incur through demolition, move the property somewhere else. So thank you, unless you have any questions.
Very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Culross?
So, sorry. Oh, can I borrow that, actually? Please. Thanks. So, my name is Jim Culross. I'm an Evanston resident, and that was a very nice speech, and I'm going to go through a presentation. I really want to focus on architecture and history, because that's what this is about. But I just want to say, and I'll go through point by point, I'll try to hit point by point and stay within our time limits.
You have to, yeah.
And just about nothing that was said there is accurate from that entire speech that was just given, and I can go through point by point and explain why. What I want to start off with, though, is just two things. One, the comment that nobody else has provided testimony to the city. So testimony can be provided in a written hearing, but it can also be provided through letters to the city from experts. And as the Planning Committee is aware, two of the most significant architectural historians in the city of Chicago took time out of their schedule, not paid architects, not promoting anyone's agenda, but they took time out of their schedule to review this house. And I'm not going to read their whole letters. You've got copies of that, but I'm going to read two sections. One is from Tim Samuelson, who is the City of Chicago's cultural historian, the former curator of architecture and design at the Chicago Historical Society, spent 15 years as a historian and restoration specialist with the Commission on Chicago Landmarks, so an expert with 30 years of experience in preservation. And he said, but let's pretend that John A. Knighton had nothing to do with this house. It still stands on its own as an exceptional architectural work of the period and complements the materials, scale, and overall quality of the streetscape. Walking the site yesterday, I was impressed by the house's strong presence on the west side of the street, even though it is surrounded by later area structures, et cetera. Also, Terry Tatum, another architectural historian, the former director of research historic preservation from the city of Chicago for 14 years, from 2000 to 2014, and instructor of historic preservation program for the last 18 years at the School of Art Institute of Chicago, said, even without the connection to a significant architect, the Knighton House is a handsomely designed house, exemplary of the colonial revival architectural design. Its use of brick, wood, and tile is very fine, exhibiting the best craftsmanship. The house's front entrance with a pediment and surround and multi-panel door is excellently proportioned, as is the adjacent front porch with a beautiful door order columns. I could keep going, but I just want to make sure that point's clear, that two folks with a combined 60 years of experience in architecture and preservation, not paid supporters, but people who took time out of their own schedule and wrote those letters to the city. One other thing, and then I'll get started. In this book is something called the Victory Monument, which is a monument which we'll go through in my presentation today. I'm not sure why folks missed it when they were looking through this book, but the Victory Monument is both a National Historic Register site and a City of Chicago landmark. The architect of that, it's in here, you can look in the index and find it. The architect of that site was John Knighton. And so his work is in here. His monuments are in this book, and they're in a lot of other books too, so we're going to go through that too, because my library is a little different than Sigma Chi's. So let's start with the presentation. What I'd like to talk about today is a couple different things. 2 points. Basically, The house itself is a really, really nice house that should be saved. It stands on its own, even without the connection to Knighton. And that's the consistent theme you hear from all the folks who are in favor of this. The other thing I want to go through is just how much Knighton contributed to the city of Evanston, to the city of Chicago, and to the state at large. He was an excellent, excellent architect. And so let's just get started with some exterior photos. This is so folks, if you haven't had a chance to walk by, can see the house. So the house is brick. You look at the materials of the house. It has had some deferred maintenance, but it is a brick house with a tile roof. It has a porch. Colonial Revival homes, only about the top 10% of Colonial Revival homes would have a porch on them. So it's a very special feature to have a front porch. And this is the view that you see from across the street from the Lakeshore Historic District when you walk by. This is the back of the house. What Knighton did with the Colonial Revival here is what every really good architect does, is they experiment with a structure for their own home. And so you can see Colonial Revival elements, but then you can see things like the arched window in the back, things that he made the house special by doing himself. This is the south side of the house, very traditional Colonial Revival, double sunroom areas, very well proportioned. You can see some of the other details. If you look on the tops of each window, there's a limestone pediment surrounded by brick detailing. Really, really excellent craftsmanship in terms of the house. This is a north view. This is an aerial view from the condominium building next door at 1730 Hinman. And we have many, many folks in the audience from that building today. And they look down on this building. These are people who look at this every day. And we have 100% support from the neighbors as part of this, as part of trying to save this house. And the folks who look down on this, they say, you know, one of the reasons I bought my condominium, one of the reasons I picked Evanston to retire in is because I get to look at something like this every day. So folks have different opinions on whether or not a tile roof and original 100-year-old copper roofs are significant, but all the folks who look at this every day think it's significant. There's the front door that you can see pointed out by one of the architectural historians with 30 years of experience in Chicago, and you can see all the classic designs of a Colonial Revival. It's got an open pediment top, it's got an arched transom, divided light windows, etc. 8-door columns on the front porch, you know, just again, a really, really neat feature to put a front porch on a house like this. This house is only about a block away from the Women's Club of Evanston, which is a Mayo building, a landmark and National Historic Register building, which has a similar type front porch. These are dormers along the top, very Colonial Revival in the sense that they're very symmetrical. You'll see that in a lot of the features. So while he did experiment and put a few unique elements on the house, many of the features, including the windows and the dormers and things like that, are extremely symmetrical. But they also include the detailing. You can see the arched upper window to provide more light into the third floor, which is unusual for that time period. And there's that arched window he did in back to bring light into the center entry, because as a colonial house, it has a center entry stairwell. Another unique aspect of this house is it has a coach house. If you look at the Lakeshore Historic District inventory, only a couple dozen coach houses are inventoried out of about 800 structures in the Lakeshore Historic District. So having a coach house is a very unique thing. The tile roof has been replaced with asphalt, but the original carriage house doors are on this side. In fact, this house was so special that the year after it was built in 1922, it was featured in the American Architect, the Architectural Review, in a full-page ad that was put in by Pacific Steel Heating Boilers, who did the boiler system in it. They thought enough of this house at that time to put it in an architectural review with a full-page ad. Again, a pretty special house. I mean, this is what everybody who looks at this house, whether they're experts in architectural history, whether they're neighbors, whether the folks who put the boiler in 80 years ago, they're all saying the same thing. Special house, and that's why it gets all this attention. And that's why it has come before the city before, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about John Knighton, the architect. So we now know that his work is in this book, the AAA book. And we know his work is in a lot of other books as well. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's just do a summary of his work. So he designed approximately 300 buildings, highly prolific in Evanston, Chicago, Illinois, and the country. He built large-scale buildings, large dollar, large-scale buildings, apartments, hotels, houses, hospitals, etc. He's got 8 individually listed properties on the National Historic Register. That alone is a huge accomplishment that puts him in rarefied company among architects. Additionally, he's got at least 8 other area and inventory listings for National Historic listings. Just in Evanston, he has 7 Evanston landmark properties. We'll go through some of those. He's got several City of Chicago landmarks, and he was appointed by the governor of Illinois, the state architect from 1926 to 1927. So pretty impressive guy. But let's talk about the books, because this issue came up at the Preservation Commission, which, by the way, was not a split vote. It was a unanimous 6-0 vote. The reason why there was confusion at the original meeting was because folks were confused about the covenant, because this house was special enough before that 41 years ago, before any historic districts, before you could landmark a property, so Mr. Knighton's daughter couldn't come and landmark something because the ordinance didn't exist. The house was special enough then where all the neighbors across the street, when Sigma Chi purchased it, were up in arms. They went to the city. There was a zoning board of appeals on it, and they put both a covenant restricting the house, and it's not a single-family appearance. It's to maintain this property as a single family. So this specific house, they put a covenant and passed an ordinance at that time, 41 years ago. So this house was protected before the other 1,000 structures in Evanston that are currently protected as being landmarks and part of historic districts. It was protected ahead of any of them. But let's talk about architecture and history books. Again, this issue came up at the Preservation Commission as well, that Knighton isn't in any books, and that's just not true. Like just about everything that was said, it's just not true. So let's go through some of the books. A book that was put out just about 10 years ago, you can find it in the bookstore, Chicago Apartments, A Century of Lakefront Luxury by Neil Harris. He took the entire lakefront of Chicago, and he took all the buildings near the lakefront, and he came up with a list of the all-time best buildings. It was less than 100 buildings. Knighton has 2 of those less than 100, and the other architects in this book are all the names that Mr. Hesner was talking about. It's all famous architects. And this isn't just something that's recent from 2004. His work was recognized consistently going back since he built the buildings. In 1928, Baird and Warner put out the first ever portfolio of fine apartment homes. It was kind of a landmark publication that listed all the best apartment buildings in Chicago. And again, Knighton's work was there right alongside all the very best architects in Chicago. He's in a book you may have at home on the coffee table, A Tour Through the City's History by Marjorie Blair Perkins, Evanston history book. The Western Architect, an architectural journal, published Knighton 4 times in the 19-teens, twice for houses, once for a low-rise apartment building, and once for a church. The History of Development of Building Construction in Chicago in 1949 highlights Mr. Knighton's work. North Park University, which Knighton designed the grounds of, and many of the original buildings which are still standing today, history book put out just 8 years ago details how Knighton developed that campus and a large number of buildings. The AIA guide here, the Victory Monument, is included there. And there's specific actual historical write-ups on Knighton and his background.
Jim,
Yes.
this is amazing presentation,
Thank you.
but we're
We'll
going to
speed up.
have to bring it to a close.
Okay.
We really are. This really has to come. We have to move on. I think you've given a very convincing.
Well, we haven't even gone through any of his buildings in
Well, that's too
Chicago.
bad. We're getting the point that he is a very recognized architect, but we just can't go on. We have an enormous amount of work to do.
Okay.
And this is an introduction.
Sure.
and-
So that's totally fine. So let me just say in summary, I just would like to say in summary that
And we have a
Yes, you
number
have.
of residents who would like to speak, and I believe most of them probably are going to be very supportive of your
Yes.
position.
So let me just say, and just let me summarize for a minute or two. Let me just say that you've got the materials that show dozens of buildings designed by Knighton. They're landmark buildings. They're National Historic Register properties. The cost figures that were presented, we have reached out to Jim Kassenholz, who is an expert at historic renovation. He did the Oscar Mayer House in Evanston recently, which you may know on Forest Avenue. He estimated a full museum-quality exterior restoration of this house from an on-site visit to the point of taking all the windows out of the house, putting them in steam baths, taking the paint off, reassembling all the glass, putting them all back in, all brand new roof, everything to a quality that's above almost any house in Evanston. He estimated that cost at $335,000 for the exterior. So I just want to make sure that we just clear up a couple of these misstatements before we let other people speak. And then the only
Do
other.
you have that in writing, or?
Yes, I do, and it's in the presentation.
One of the things
as
our
well.
staff has just told me that we can put your presentation on our city's website
Sure,
tomorrow, if you
sure.
would like that.
That's fine. That's fine. So, so I just want to make sure we cover that the cost estimates seem dramatically out of line with what a historic preservation expert who does that for a living in Evanston said. And let me just turn it over in the interest of time to other folks. I could keep going, but I will honestly tell you, if given enough time, every single point that was made is inaccurate. This is a fantastic house. Everybody who sees it appreciates it. That's why it was put in architectural magazines the year after it was built. That's why architectural historians are standing up for it. That's why we have 100% support across neighbors. Landmarks Illinois, the respected not-for-profit that saved buildings in Illinois, came out in full support of saving this home. So we have neighbors, we have architectural historians. Neiden designed a Swedish-American museum in Philadelphia, the oldest in the country. The director of that museum has written to the city. And so I just want to say that there's just tons of written evidence. So I hope folks have a time to go through all the materials because there's quite a few. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, I'm always happy to answer any of them.
Thank you. Alderman Fisk.
Yes, Alderman Rainey, I do not see any photographs of the other Evanston houses in the presentation, and I would just like to cycle through them. It can't take more than 30 seconds just to run through, because I don't know what they are.
So I'm happy to do that if that's okay.
Okay, if you want. They're all going to be on the city's website tomorrow, but if you want to take the time now.
Yeah, because they're not in what's in the packets.
I would like to add one point of information for everybody that people might be wondering about, and that is our Director of Community Development's maiden name is Neiden, and there is absolutely no relation to the John Neiden we're discussing, even though her grandfather's name was John Neiden, great-grandfather.
John August.
So,
The name was actually John August Neiden.
Yeah.
There is no relation.
okay.
Just to clear that up.
So this is going to be a 30-second review, but here's Neiden's buildings in 30 seconds. National Historic Register and Evanston Landmark.
Okay, just click right through them, okay?
Yep,
Because
National
we
Historic
have to-
Register, Evanston Landmark, same, ditto. Evanshire Hotel, where Lucky Platter Restaurant's located. He designed the whole block there, $2.5 million write-up on ultra-modern apartments from 1922. As you're driving up Sheridan Road, you'll pass his vintage apartment buildings. Most of them are condos now. 1% of Evanston residents live in a vintage Neiden apartment building. He basically created the character of Southeast Evanston. He also built in downtown Evanston, Hahn Building, Evanston Landmark, downtown Evanston. He built houses as well, 2855 Sheridan Place, Evanston Landmark. In Chicago, City of Chicago Landmark, National Register of Historic Places, the best example of a community bank building, Belmont Sheffield Trust and Savings Bank. 257 East Delaware, the condominium building that appears in all those history books. The Victory Monument in Chicago and Bronzeville, celebrating an African-American regiment that lost 137 lives in World War I. The Admiral Apartment Hotel, also appearing in all the history books. Fairfax Apartment Hotel. These are just a handful. Commonwealth Hotel in Chicago. The Eastwood Apartment Hotel, the oldest known residential hotel built in Chicago in the 20th century, is a Neiden building. First Swedish Baptist Church, 1242 West Addison, orange listed by the City of Chicago, soon to be City of Chicago landmark. North Park College with Neiden design, some of his example buildings, they still are in existence today, but it's neat that postcards exist of them. In Illinois and beyond, the grandstand at the State Fairgrounds, the biggest thing at the State Fairground in Illinois, holds 13,000 people, and the whole entire fairground is a National Historic Site. Goddard Chapel, Rose Hill Cemetery, Marion, National Historic Register, and here's the American Swedish Historical Museum in Philadelphia. This is just a handful. This isn't all of them. This is just some of the stuff that this man did. So, and the house is completely original, too. It's had no renovations to it, so it's historically 100% intact. And just one last thing, and then I'll turn it over to supporters. The Evanston Preservation Ordinance is very clear. 7 different parties can nominate a structure. The last listed, the 7th listed, is the owner of the property. So the ordinance absolutely envisions many, many other people nominating properties. It's not up to specific folks to decide history. That's why we have historical districts that include some people who are in favor of that, some people who are opposed to it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
For the supporters, if you think we've heard enough, you may pass. Let's see. I think it's Carl Morris. No, I'm sorry, that's those. Mary McWilliams. That's very clear.
I will be brief.
As someone who sat, I am Mary McWilliams, as someone who sat on the Preservation Commission's Evaluation Committee from its inception in 1977 to its dissolution in 1987, I can only say that the only reason that we missed this building, we evaluated, the committee evaluated all of the buildings that were ultimately determined by the commission to be landmarks. The committee would have looked at this building in part of its earliest work in 1977 and 78. Those first evaluations taught us the magnitude of the work still to be done. We did not go back to any area to see if we had missed any buildings. As it was, it took us 10 years to complete the initial survey of the city. Those of us on the evaluation committee believed that ideally the survey process would be one in which the Preservation Commission conducted a systematic resurveys of the city's buildings. The house at 1726 Hinman was not included in the Lakeshore Historic District because of strict National Park Service rules on district boundaries, which do not allow crossing the street to include mid-block to pick up a single building. For that reason only, 1726 Hinman was not included in the Lakeshore Historic District. The purpose of the recent resurvey of the Lakeshore Historic District was to review and update the history of the buildings inside the district only, and not to change buildings or add buildings to the district. For that reason, 1726 Hinman was not added to the district. I regret that the Commission did not designate the building, 1726 Hinman, back in the 1970s, but I wholeheartedly support its designation now. It is a fine building by an architect who was important in the architectural history of Evanston and Illinois. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Singh?
I just want to support what Mary McWilliams just said.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Jim, you just spoke. Peggy and Phil Reitz.
Hello, I'm Peggy Reitz, and I live at 1725 Hinman. I live directly across the street. I have to say I'm very sympathetic to Sigma Chi. Honestly, I'm a little sister of Sigma Chi back from my sorority days. We have husband is a fraternity member. I also have a master's in philanthropy and nonprofit management, so I understand how foundations run. I am shocked that Sigma Chi, for that many years, was so short-sighted that they did not put any money into keeping up this building. They have a Buildings and Grounds Committee. They have a Development Committee. Why did those people not see that it was starting to deteriorate? It was very obvious. For the past, they said it's been 3 years. It's been many, many more years to get to this state. I cannot help but feel that they are responsible for the condition of that building, and they should be responsible for dealing with the financial impacts. That's all. Thank you.
Betty Esther. Oops, wait, Betty does not want to speak to this issue. Okay. At the top of the list was a person named Noah Phelps. Did you want to speak, sir?
I represent the owner, and
Do you want to speak?
questions, but I don't have anything to say at this point.
Okay, okay. Scott spoke, and Mr. Morris? Finish, okay. All right, so that ends the, Betty, you want to speak about something else, right? Yeah, not about this. Okay, so, all right, I think that concludes this issue.
Madam Chairman, if I can.
Pardon me? Okay.
If I can just say one thing.
One thing, yeah, and then we'll do.
What I think is important is you looked at pictures that were presented. If you look at the rest of the presentation that we gave, which is not from across the street or the surrounding, it's up close, you will notice that this property does not look like these pictures. It has substantial issues regarding it. And if it can be fixed for $335,000 and that person's willing to sign a contract saying that's all it'll cost, I suggest the city hires them to go do the Harley Clark Mansion. That number just is not a sensible number. It has no credibility to it at all. And if it does, I would urge your council, go get a contract, have them sign it right now and fix your problem for that price.
You've got your problems, we've got our problems. Don't mix them up. You're mixing Harley Clark and Sigma Chi. We don't mix this. All right, stop. The woman who wants to speak, I'm going to give you like 2 seconds. Come on up. Who didn't sign up? Who? Come on. Okay, let's not force her to speak, for goodness sakes. What? I have everybody here. You're not on it.
All right.
Right.
I'm Susana
Are you on
Hyland.
this- are you
I'm
on the
the
subject?
second sheet, as far as I know. I did, maybe I signed the wrong form.
Speak, tell us your name.
So Sina Hyland, 1719 Hinman.
You don't have to tell us where you live. Just tell us what you want to say.
I moved into Evanston about 2 years ago, and being in a historic district was a big part of why we moved here. And yes, we recognize that upkeep has some cost in it, but I find the numbers somewhat unrealistic. I'm not a contractor, but my key point is that living across the street from that building and seeing structures that are similar to that in the neighborhood has made a big impact on our decision to move here, and we'd like to see buildings like that remain.
Good point. Thank you. Okay. All right. So we have before us the property, and it's been recommended that it become a landmark. Do I have any lights? No, I see no lights. So it is for introduction. I'm wondering, do we want to move this to the council?
My impression is that keeping it with the committee is not an option. Is that correct?
That's true. It's not an option. Okay, so
I'd be interested, the owners represented that they are considering some alternative, maybe alternative is the wrong word, but just considering what maybe the options are. I would be interested in seeing what they can come back with. So if we can, keep it on the table and discuss it further.
don't say table.
Okay,
Moving
I'm not
to the council.
tabling it,
I know,
but
that's-
keep it
Yeah.
on the forefront.
All right, so you're recommending we move introduction and hopefully hear his options at our meeting when it's before the council. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, that's correct. I didn't hear any hints of those options, though, tonight. Alderman Fisk.
Alderman Rainey, I would prefer to keep it here in committee, but my question is, why can't we?
Michelle
Because
said
we
can't.
can't. We've already kept it here.
Correct. You already held it one other time. This would be the second hold,
Okay.
and it's prohibited
It
under 18.12.
doesn't hurt to move it to the council.
This is just for introduction.
No, I've been here before. I
The
understand that.
council, just so you know, the council can table it at some other.
Or refer it back.
What I'm trying to do is find out if there is a way to get more information and for us to have it back here at committee, if we can bring it back to committee for discussion, because clearly there's some information that we do not have.
If you just listen for 1 second, we
Okay.
can move introduction, send it to the council. If the owner of the property brings us some information that we would like to consider, and it's going to take us time to consider, we can table it to a date certain.
Okay, I also want to be sure that we're following the rules in the Preservation Commission about the time frame that's available to us to make a decision on this, because I believe it's what?
Preservation deadlines. I was about to say, Alderman Rainey had just said it could be held to a date certain, and I was going to remind you of that point. But the preservation deadline, I'd have to
Okay.
check the code.
Could I ask Carlos Ruiz about, is there a date certain, Carlos, that we need to take some action at council on this?
Good evening, members of Planning and Development Committee. There are certain requirements. I'm just trying to find in the ordinance the number of days that the City Council has to make a decision. Otherwise, it would be like there's no decision, then there's no action on it.
I believe I can answer that.
Are you saying Preservation Commission trumps the council?
No. The ordinance says that if the after the council receives the report from the city council, there's a certain number of days that the council has to make a decision, and if they don't, then I just want to make sure that I find the right text. If you could just give me a moment.
It's 120 days.
120 days from the from the
We
time.
have a few days.
Yeah,
Carlos, it's 120 days from the date
from the
of...
time you receive the report from the commission.
Okay.
So would you consider the time we received the report 2 weeks ago when we held it?
Correct.
Right, okay. Right. So our staff can give us the date by which we have to act. So we can,
4 months. 4 months.
yeah. We should get a lot of options. All right, so, all right. No, actually not right now. You can talk to staff afterwards. So the motion has been made and seconded to move this to the council for introduction. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Thank you very much. All right, so that completes our agenda for this evening. I'm just going to suggest that we have a rules. Could we?
Yeah, with regard to Rules Committee, we're going to defer until,
No, we're going to have,
for the council meeting?
No, I signed up for this committee.
for planning and development.
She just asked
Okay.
you. She called you.
Yes, you did,
Okay.
but I didn't see what item you wanted to talk to us about. I'm sorry. I thought you meant for the council meeting. I'm sorry. Betty Esther?
That's okay.
You're next.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Betty Esther. We have an item for discussion that is always before this committee, and that is the affordable housing issue, which is one of the goals that the council set for the city. The inclusionary zoning ordinance has certain tools in it, and one of it is fee in lieu of setting aside the unit for the person to move in. I think that need to be restricted from the inclusionary tool, because by the time you collect enough fee to build a unit for a person, you are 3 or 4 years down the line. When that unit is finished and that person can move in, he doesn't have to wait for 2 or 3 projects to add more money. That this in fee of lieu should be restricted from the inclusionary zoning. If you're going to have, like you said you would, people that are at the 30% or 50% below the area median income, then that is the item that you need to strike from your inclusionary zoning orders so that those people would have units to move in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Betty, Miss Esther, could you talk to, who should you talk to? I would like a clarification. Who? About clarifying that provision, so that,
That should be Sarah.
Sarah, could you sit with her, and, are you free during the week at all, so we could get a clarification of that? Because I have some problems with that whole provision, but I'm not sure I understand what you just said.
In the inclusionary zoning ordinance, I know I don't have time this week, but I'll give her my number and she can call, and in betweens I will talk to her. But it's in the ordinance, it says in lieu of the person getting in the unit, they will give the city a fee. And that is a disservice to the people here that need affordable housing.
All right, we'll pin that down. Okay. All right.
All right, adjourn this one.
The Rules Committee should not meet after this, right?
Right, we're going to convene the Rules Committee on June 26th,
Okay, that's, okay, all right.
in the interest of time.
All right, we're adjourning this, and we'll start the city council meeting at about 5 to 9.